Section 9 of Across Asia on a Bicycle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tony Oliva. Across Asia on a Bicycle by Thomas Allen. Chapter 5. Over the Gobi Desert and through the western gate of the Great Wall. Russian influence, which even now predominates at Kuldja, was forcibly indicated the day after our arrival during our investigations as to the validity of our Chinese passports for the journey to Peking. The Russian consul, whose favor we had secured in advance through letters from Governor Ivanov at Verneuil, had pronounced them not only good, but by far the best that had been presented by any traveler entering China at this point. After endeavoring to dissuade us from what he called a foolhardy undertaking, even with the most valuable papers, he sent us, with his interpreter, to Kuldja Tutai for the proper visé. That dignitary, though deeply interested, was almost amused at the boldness of our enterprise. He said that no passport would ensure success by the method we proposed to pursue; that before he could allow us to make the venture, we must wait for an order from Peking. This, he said, would subject us to considerable delay and expense, even if the telegraph and post were utilized through Siberia and Kyakhta. This was discouraging indeed. But when we discovered a few minutes later that His Highness had to call in the learned secretary to trace our proposed route for him on the map of China, and even to locate the capital, Peking, we began to question his knowledge of Chinese diplomacy. The matter was again referred to by the consul, who reported back the following day that his previous assurances were reliable, that the Tutai would make the necessary visés and send away at once, by the regular relay post across the empire, an open letter that could be read by the officials along the route, and be delivered long before our arrival at Peking. Such easy success we had not anticipated. The difficulty, as well as necessity, of obtaining the proper credentials for traveling in China was impressed upon us by the arrest the previous day of 3 Afghan visitors, and by the fact that a German traveler had been refused, just a few weeks before, permission even to cross the Mozart Pass into Kashgar. So much, we thought, for Russian friendship. Upon this assurance of at least official consent to hazard the journey to Peking, a telegram was sent to the chief of police at Tomsk, to whose care we had directed our letters, photographic material, and bicycle supplies to be sent from London, in the expectation of being forced to take the Siberian route. These last could not have been dispensed with much longer, as our cushioned tires, ball bearings, and axles were badly worn, while the rim of one of the rear wheels was broken in 8 places for the lack of spokes. These supplies, however, did not reach us till 6 weeks after the date of our telegram, to which a prepaid reply was received, after a week's delay, asking in advance for the extra postage. This, with that prepaid from London, amounted to just $50. The warm weather, after the extreme cold of a Siberian winter, had caused the tires to stretch so much beyond their intended size that, on their arrival, they were almost unfit for use. Some of our photographic material also had been spoiled through the useless inspection of postal officials. The delay thus caused was well utilized in familiarizing ourselves as much as possible with the language and characteristics of the Chinese, for, as we were without guides, interpreters, or servants, and in some places lacked even official assistance, no travelers, perhaps, were ever more dependent upon the people than ourselves. The Chinese language, the most primitive in the world, is, for this very reason perhaps, the hardest to learn. Its poverty of words reduces its grammar almost to a question of syntax and intonation. Many a time our expressions, by a wrong inflection, would convey a meaning different from the one intended. Even when told the difference, our ears could not detect it. Our work of preparation was principally a process of elimination. We now had to prepare for a forced march in case of necessity. Handlebars and seat posts were shortened to save weight, and even the leather baggage carriers fitting in the frames of the machines, which we ourselves had patented before leaving England, were replaced by a couple of sleeping bags made for us out of woolen shawls and Chinese oiled canvas. The cutting off of buttons and extra parts of our clothing, as well as the shaving of our heads and faces, was also included by our friends in the list of curtailments. For the same reason, one of our cameras, which we always carried on our backs and refilled at night under the bedclothes, we sold to a Chinese photographer at Suidun to make room for an extra provision bag. The surplus film, with our extra baggage, was shipped by post via Siberia and Kiakhta to meet us on our arrival in Peking. And now the money problem was the most perplexing of all. "This alone," said the Russian consul, "if nothing else, will defeat your plans." Those Western bankers who advertise to furnish letters of credit to any part of the world are, to say the least, rather sweeping in their assertions. At any rate, our own London letter was of no use beyond the Bosporus, except with the Persian imperial banks run by an English syndicate. At the American Bible House in Constantinople we were allowed, as a personal favor, to buy drafts on the various missionaries along the route through Asiatic Turkey. But in Central Asia we found that the Russian bankers and merchants would not handle English paper, and we were therefore compelled to send our letter of credit by mail to Moscow. Thither we had recently sent it on leaving Tashkent, with instructions to remit in currency to Irkutsk in Siberia. We now had to telegraph to that point to re-forward over the Kiakhta post route to Peking, with the cash on hand and the proceeds of the camera, sold for more than half its weight in silver, 4 1/3 pounds. We thought we had sufficient money to carry us, or rather as much as we could carry, to that point, for the weight of the Chinese money necessary for a journey of over 3,000 miles was, as the Russian consul thought, one of the greatest of our almost insurmountable obstacles. In the interior of China there is no coin except the chen or sapix, an alloy of copper and tin in the form of a disc, having a hole in the center by which the coins may be strung together. The very recently coined liang or tael, the Mexican piaster, especially minted for the Chinese market, and the other foreign coins have not yet penetrated from the coast. For 600 miles over the border, however, we found both the Russian money and language serviceable among the Tartar merchants, while the tenga or Kashgar silver piece was preferred by the natives, even beyond the Gobi, being much handier than the larger or smaller bits of silver broken from the Yamba bricks. All, however, would have to be weighed in the tinza or small Chinese scales we carried with us, and on which were marked the fun, chan, and liang of the monetary scale. But the value of these terms is reckoned in chen, and changes with almost every district. This necessity for vigilance, together with the frequency of bad silver and loaded yambas, and the propensity of the Chinese to "knock down" on even the smallest purchase, tends to convert a traveler in China into a veritable Shylock. There being no banks or exchanges in the interior, we were obliged to purchase at Kuldja all the silver we would need for the entire journey of over 3,000 miles. How much would it take, was the question that our past experience in Asiatic travel now aided us to answer. That our calculations were close is proved by the fact that we reached Peking with silver in our pockets to the value of $half. Our money now constituted the principal part of our luggage, which, with camera and film, weighed just 25 pounds apiece. Most of the silver was chopped up into small bits and placed in the hollow tubing of the machines to conceal it from Chinese inquisitiveness, if not something worse. We are glad to say, however, that no attempt at robbery was ever discovered, although efforts at extortion were frequent, and sometimes, as will appear, of a serious nature. The blowing of the long horns and boom of the mortar cannon at the fort awoke us at daylight on the morning of July 13th. Farewells had been said the night before. Only our good-hearted Russian host was up to put an extra morsel in our provision bag, for, as he said, we could get no food until we reached the Kirghiz Aouls on the high plateau of the Talki Pass, by which we were to cut across over unbeaten paths to the regular so-called Imperial Highway running from Suidun. From the Catholic missionaries at Kuldja, we had obtained very accurate information about this route as far as the Gobi Desert. The expression Tian Shan Pelu, or Northern Tian Shan Route, in opposition to the Tian Shan Na Lu, or Northern Tian Shan Route, shows that the Chinese had fully appreciated the importance of this historic highway, which continues the road running from the extreme western gate of the Great Wall obliquely across Mongolian Kansu, through Hami and Barkul to Urumtsi. From here the two natural highways lead, one to the headwaters of the Black Irtish, the other to the passes leading into the Li Valley and other routes of the Arolo-Caspian depression. The latter route, which is now commanded at intervals by Chinese forts and military settlements, was recently relinquished by Russia only when she had obtained a more permanent footing on the former in the trading posts of Chugutchak and Kobdo, for she very early recognized the importance of this most natural entry to the only feasible route across the Chinese Empire. In a glowing sunset at the end of a hot day's climb, we looked for the last time over the Li Valley, and at dusk, an hour later, rolled into one of the Kirghiz Aouls that are here scattered among the rich pasturage of the plateau. Even here we found that our reputation had extended from Kuldja. The chief advanced with the amans of welcome, and the heavy matted curtains in the kibitka doorway were raised as we passed, in token of honor. When the refreshing kumis was served around the evening campfire, the dangers of the journey through China were discussed among our hosts with frequent looks of misgiving. Thus, from first to last, every judgment was against us, and every prediction was of failure, if not of something worse. And now, as we stole out from the tent by the light of the rising moon, even the spectre-like mountain peaks around us, like symbols of coming events, were casting their shadows before. there was something so elusive in the scene as to make it very impressive. In the morning, early, a score of horsemen were ready to escort us on the road. At parting, they all dismounted and uttered a prayer to Allah for our safety, and then, as we rode away, drew their fingers across their throats in silence and waved a solemn goodbye. Such was the almost superstitious fear of these western nomads for the land which once sent forth a Yengiz Khan along this very highway. Down the narrow valley of the Quitoon, which flows into the Ebinor, startling the mountain deer from the brink of the tree-arched rivulet, we reached a spot which once was the haunt of a band of those border robbers about whom we had heard so much from our apprehensive friends. At the base of a volcano-shaped mountain lay the ruins of their former dens, from which only a year ago they were wont to sally forth on the passing caravans. When they were exterminated by the government, the head of their chief, with its dangling queue, was mounted on a pole near by and preserved in a cage from birds of prey, as a warning to all others who might aspire to the same notoriety. In this lonely spot we were forced to spend the night, as here occurred, through the carelessness of the Kuldja Russian blacksmith, a very serious break in one of our gear wheels. It was too late in the day to walk back the 16 miles to the Kirghiz encampment and there obtain horses for the remaining 58 miles to Kuldja, for nowhere else, we concluded, could such a break be mended. Our sleeping bags were now put to a severe test between the damp ground and the heavy mountain dew. The penetrating cold and the occasional panther-like cry of some prowling animal kept us awake the greater part of the night, awaiting with revolvers in hand some expected attack. 5 days later we had repassed this spot and were toiling over the sand and saline covered depression of the great Hanhai, or dried up sea. The mountain freshets, dissolving the salt from their sandy channels, carry it down in solution and deposit it with evaporation in massive layers, forming a comparatively hard roadway in the midst of the shifting sand dunes. Over these latter our progress was extremely slow. One stretch of 15 miles, which it took us 6 hours to cover, was as formidable as any part of the Turkoman Desert along the Trans-Caspian Railway, at an altitude of only 600 feet above the sea, according to our aneroid barometer, and beneath the rays of a July sun against which even our felt caps were not much protection. We were half dragging, half pushing our wheels through a foot of sand, and slapping at the mosquitoes swarming upon our necks and faces. These pests, which throughout this low country are the largest and most numerous we have ever met, are bred in the intermediate swamps, which exist only through the negligence of the neighboring villagers. At night, smoldering fires, which half suffocate the human inmates, are built before the doors and windows to keep out the intruding insects. All travelers wear gloves and a huge hood covering the head and face up to the eyes, and in their hands carry a horsetail switch to lash back and forth over the shoulders. Being without such protection, we suffered both day and night. The mountain freshets all along the road to Urumtsi were more frequent and dangerous than any we had yet encountered. Toward evening, the melting snows and the condensing currents from the plain, heated during the day, fill and overflow the channels, that in the morning are almost dry. One stream, with its 10 branches, swept the stones and boulders over a shifting channel 1 mile in width. It was when wading through such streams as this, where every effort was required to balance ourselves and our luggage, that the mosquitoes would make up for lost time with impunity. The river, before reaching Manas, was so swift and deep as to necessitate the use of regular government carts. A team of 3 horses, on making a misstep, were shifted away from the ford into deep water and carried far down the stream. A caravan of Chinese traveling vans, loaded with goods from India, were crossing at the time, on their way to the outlying provinces and the Russian border. General Baumann at Verneuil had informed us that in this way English goods were swung clear around the circle and brought into Russia through the unguarded back door. With constant wading and tramping, our Russian shoes and stockings, one of which was almost torn off by the sly grab of a Chinese spaniel, were no longer fit for use. In their place we were now obliged to purchase the short, white cloth Chinese socks and string sandals, which for mere cycling purposes and wading streams proved an excellent substitute, being light and soft on the feet and very quickly dried. The calves of our legs, however, being left bare, we were obliged, for state occasions at least, to retain and utilize the upper portion of our old stockings. It was owing to this scantiness of wardrobe that we were obliged, when taking a bath by the roadside streams, to make a quick wash of our linen and put it on wet to dry, or allow it to flutter from the handlebars as we rode along. It was astonishing, even to ourselves, how little a man required when once beyond the pale of Western conventionalities. From Manas to Urumtsi we began to strike more tillage and fertility. Maize, wheat, and rice were growing, but rather low and thin. The last is by no means the staple food of China, as is commonly supposed, except in the southern portion. In the northern, and especially the outlying provinces, it is considered more a luxury for the wealthy. Millet and coarse flour, from which the mien or dough strings are made, is the foundation, at least, for more than half the subsistence of the common classes. Nor is there much truth, we think, in the assertion that Chinamen eat rats, although we sometimes regretted that they did not. After a month or more without meat, a dish of rats would have been relished, had we been able to get it. On the other hand, we have learned that there is a society of Chinamen who are vegetarians from choice, and still another that will eat the meat of no animal, such as the ass, horse, dog, etc., which can serve man in a better way. Urumtsi, or Hun Miao, Red Temple of the Chinese, still retains its ancient prestige in being the seat of government for the viceroyalty of Xinjiang, which includes all that portion of western China lying without the limit of Mongolia and Tibet. Thanks to its happy position, it has always rapidly recovered after every fresh disaster. It now does considerable trade with Russia through the town of Chugutchak, and with China through the great gap which here occurs in the Tian Shan range. It lies in a picturesque amphitheater behind the solitary Holy Mount, which towers above a well-constructed bridge across its swiftly flowing river. This city was one of our principal landmarks across the empire. A long stage of the journey was here completed. Section 9.
Section 10 of Across Asia on a Bicycle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Shipp. Across Asia on a Bicycle by Thomas Allen. Chapter 5, Over the Gobi Desert, Part 2. On entering a Chinese city, we always made it a rule to run rapidly through until we came to an inn, and then lock up our wheels before the crowd could collect. Urumtsi, however, was too large and intricate for such a manoeuvre. We were obliged to dismount in the principal thoroughfare. The excited throng pressed in upon us. Among them was a Chinaman who could talk a little Russian, and who undertook to direct us to a comfortable inn at the far end of the city. This street parade gathered to the inn-yard an overwhelming mob, and announced to the whole community that the foreign horses had come. It had been posted, we were told, a month before, that 2 people of the New World were coming through on strange iron horses, and everyone was requested not to molest them. By this, public curiosity was raised to the highest pitch. When we returned from supper at a neighbouring restaurant, we were treated to a novel scene. The doors and windows of our apartments had been blocked with boxes, bales of cotton, and huge cartwheels to keep out the irrepressible throng. Our host was agitated to tears. He came out wringing his hands and urging upon us that any attempt on our part to enter would cause a rush that would break his house down. We listened to his entreaties on the condition that we should be allowed to mount to the roof with a ladder to get away from the annoying curiosity of the crowd. There we sat through the evening twilight, while the crowd below, somewhat balked, but not discouraged, stood taking in every move. Nightfall and a drizzling rain came at last to our relief. The next morning a squad of soldiers was dispatched to raise the siege, and at the same time presents began to arrive from the various officials, from the Song Tu, or Viceroy, down to the superintendent of the local prisons. The matter of how much to accept of a Chinese present, and how much to pay for it, in the way of a tip to the bearer, is one of the finest points of that finest of fine arts, Chinese etiquette. And yet in the midst of such an abundance and variety we were hopelessly at sea. Fruits and teas were brought, together with meats and chickens, and even a live sheep. Our Chinese visiting cards, with the Chinese the great insignia of rank, were now returned for those sent with the presents, and the hour appointed for the exhibition of our bicycles as requested. Long before the time, the streets and housetops leading from the inn to the Viceroy's palace at the far end of the city began to fill with people, and soldiers were detailed at our request to make an opening for us to ride through abreast. This, however, did not prevent the crowd from pushing us against each other, or sticking sticks in the wheels, or throwing their hats and shoes in front of us as we rode by. When in sight of the Viceroy's palace, they closed in on us entirely. It was the worst jam we had ever been in. By no possibility could we mount our machines, although the mob was growing more and more impatient. They kept shouting for us to ride, but would give us no room. Those on the outside pushed the inner ones against us. With the greatest difficulty could we preserve our equilibrium, and prevent the wheels from being crushed as we surged along toward the palace gate, while all the time our Russian interpreter, Mafu, on horseback in front, continued to shout and gesticulate in the wildest manner above their heads. 20 soldiers had been stationed at the palace gate to keep back the mob with cudgels. When we reached them, they pulled us and our wheels quickly through into the enclosure, and then tried to stem the tide by belabouring their heads and shoulders in reach, including those of our unfortunate interpreter Mafu. But it was no use. Everything was swept away before this surging wave of humanity. The Viceroy himself, who now came out to receive us, was powerless. All he could do was to request them to make room around the palace courtyard for the coming exhibition. Thousands of thumbs were uplifted that afternoon in praise of the wonderful tui ta che, or two-wheeled carts, as they witnessed our modest attempt at trick riding and special manoeuvring. After refreshments in the palace, to which we were invited by the Viceroy, we were counselled to leave by a rear door and return by a roundabout way to the inn, leaving the mob to wait till dark for our exit from the front. The restaurant or tea house in China takes the place of the Western clubroom. All the current news and gossip is here circulated and discussed over their eating or gambling. One of their games of chance, which we have frequently noticed, seems to consist in throwing their fingers at one another and shouting at the top of their voices. It is really a matching of numbers, for which the Chinamen make signs on their fingers, up to the numeral 10. Our entry into a crowded dungan, or native Mohammedan restaurant, the next morning was the signal for exciting accounts of the events of the previous day. We were immediately invited to take tea with this one, a morning dish of tung posas, or nut and sugar dumplings, with another, while a third came over with his can of sojoi, or Chinese gin, with an invitation to join him. The Chinese of all nations seem to live in order to eat, and from this race of epicures has developed a nation of excellent cooks. Our fare in China, outside the Gobi district, was far better than in Turkey or Persia, and for this reason we were better able to endure the increased hardships. A plate of sliced meat stewed with vegetables and served with a piquant sauce, sliced radishes, and onions with vinegar, 2 loaves of Chinese momo, or steamed bread, and a pot of tea would usually cost us about 3 1/4 cents apiece. Everything in China is sliced so that it can be eaten with the chopsticks. These we at length learned to manipulate with sufficient dexterity to pick up a dove's egg, the highest attainment in the chopstick art. The Chinese have rather a sour than a sweet tooth. Sugar is rarely used in anything, and never in tea. The steeped tea flowers, which the higher classes use, are really more tasty without it. In many of the smaller towns, our visits to the restaurant would sometimes result in considerable damage to its keepers, for the crowd would swarm in after us, knocking over the tables, stools, and crockery as they went, and collect in a circle around us to watch the "foreigners" eat, and to add their opium and tobacco smoke to the suffocating atmosphere. A visit to the local mint in Urumtsi revealed to us the primitive method of making the chen, or money discs, before mentioned. Each is moulded instead of cut and stamped as in the West. By its superintendent we were invited to a special breakfast on the morning of our departure. The Chinese are the only people in the Orient, and so far as we know, in the European and Asiatic continents, who resemble the Americans in their love for a good substantial morning meal. This was much better adapted to our purpose than the Russian custom, which compelled us to do the greater part of our day's work on merely bread and weak tea. From Urumtsi we had decided to take the northern route to Hami via Guchen and Barkul, in order to avoid as much as possible the sands of the Tarim Basin on the southern slope of the Tian Shan Mountains. 2 guards were commissioned by the Viceroy to take us in charge and hand us over to the next relay station. Papers were given them to be signed by the succeeding authorities on our safe arrival. This plan had been adopted by every chief mandarin along the route, in order not only to follow out the request of the London minister as written on the passport, but principally to do us honour in return for the favour of a bicycle exhibition. But many times we would leave our discomfited guards to return with unsigned papers. Had we been travelling in the ordinary way, not only these favours might not have been shown us, but our project entirely defeated by local obstructions, as was the case with many who attempted the same journey by caravan. To the goodwill of the mandarins, as well as the people, an indispensable concomitant of a journey through China, our bicycles were, after all, our best passports. They everywhere overcame the antipathy for the foreigner and made us cordially welcome. The costumes of our soldiers were strikingly picturesque. Over the front and back of the scarlet waistcoats were worked in black silk letters their military credentials. Over their full baggy trousers were drawn their riding overalls, which cover only the front and sides of the legs, the back being cut out just above the cloth top of their Chinese boots. Instead of a cap, they wear a piece of printed cloth wrapped tightly around the head, like the American washerwomen. Their well-cushioned saddles did not save them from the constant jolting to which our high speed subjected them. At every stopping place they would hold forth at length to the curious crowd about their roadside experiences. It was amusing to hear their graphic descriptions of the mysterious ding by which they referred to the ring of the cyclometer at every mile. But the phrase "Quay Tai Hen," very fast, which concluded almost every sentence, showed what feature impressed them most. Then, too, they disliked very much to travel in the heat of the day, for all summer travelling in China is done at night. They would wake us up many hours before daylight to make a start, despite our previous request to be left alone. Our week's run to Barkul was made with a good natural road and favouring conditions, at the rate of 53 miles per day, 8 miles more than our general average across the empire. From Kuldja to the Great Wall, where our cyclometer broke, we took accurate measurements of the distances. In this way we soon discovered that the length of a Chinese li was even more changeable than the value of the tael. According to time and place, from 185 to 250 were variously reckoned to a degree, while even a difference in direction would very often make a considerable difference in the distance. It is needless to say that, at this rate, the guards did not stay with us. Official courtesy was now confined to dispatches sent in advance. Through this exceptionally wild district were encountered several herds of antelope and wild asses, which the natives were hunting with their long, heavy, fork-resting rifles. Through the exceptional tameness of the jackrabbits along the road, we were sometimes enabled to procure with a revolver the luxury of a meat supper. At Barkul, Tartar, the first evidence of English influence began to appear in the place of the fading Russian, although the traces of Russian manufacture were by no means wanting far beyond the Great Wall. English pulverized sugar now began to take the place of Russian lump. India rubber, instead of the Russianized French elastique, was a native name for our rubber tires. English letters, too, could be recognized on the second-hand paper and bagging appropriated to the natives' use, and even the gilded buttons worn by the soldiers bore the stamp of treble gilt. From here the road to Halmi turns abruptly south, and by a pass of over 9,000 feet crosses the declining spurs of the Tian Shan Mountains, which stand like a barrier between the two great historic highways, deflecting the westward waves of migration, some to Kashgaria and others to Zungaria. On the southern slope of the pass we met with many large caravans of donkeys, dragging down pine logs to serve as poles in the proposed extension of the telegraph line from Suchow to Urumtsi. In June of this year, the following item appeared in the newspapers. Within a few months, Peking will be united by wire with St. Petersburg, and in consequence with the telegraph system of the entire civilized world. According to the latest issue of the Turkestan Gazette, the telegraph line from Peking has been brought as far west as the city of Kashgar. The European end of the line is Osh, and a small stretch of about 140 miles now alone breaks the direct telegraph communication from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Hami is one of those cities which may be regarded as indispensable. At the edge of the Great Gobi and the converging point of the Nanlu and Peilu, that is, the southern and northern routes to the Western world, this oasis is a necessary resting place. During our stop of 2 days, to make necessary repairs and recuperate our strength for the hardships of the desert, the usual calls were exchanged with the leading officials. In the matter of social politeness, the Chinese, especially the literati, have reason to look down upon the barbarians of the West. Politeness has been likened generally to an air cushion. There is nothing in it, but it eases the jolts wonderfully. As a mere ritual of technicalities, it has perhaps reached its highest point in China. The multitude of honorific titles, so bewildering and even maddening to the Occidental, are here used simply to keep in view the fixed relations of graduated superiority. When wishing to be exceptionally courteous to the foreigners, the more experienced mandarins would lay their doubled fists in the palms of our hands, instead of raising them in front of their foreheads, with the usual salutation Homao. In shaking hands with a Chinaman, we thus very often had our hands full. After the exchange of visiting cards, as an indication that their visits would be welcome, they would come on foot, in carts or palanquins according to their rank, and always attended by a larger or smaller retinue. Our return visits would always be made by request, on the wheels, either alone or with our interpreter, if we could find one, for our Chinese was as yet painfully defective. Russian had served us in good stead, though not always directly. In a conversation with the Tutai of Schicho, for instance, our Russian had to be translated into Turkey and thence interpreted in Chinese. The more intelligent of these conversations were about our own and other countries of the world, especially England and Russia, who, it was rumoured, had gone to war on the Afghanistan border. But the most of them generally consisted of a series of trivial interrogations, beginning usually with, "How old are you?" Owing to our beards, which were now full grown, and which had gained for us the frequent title of Ye Ren, or wild men, the guesses were far above the mark. One was even as high as 60 years, for the reason, as was stated, that no Chinaman could raise such a beard before that age. We were frequently surprised at their persistence in calling us brothers when there was no apparent reason for it, and were finally told that we must be because we were both named Mr. on our passports. It was almost dusk on the evening of August 10 when we drew up to the hamlet of Shang Lu Shui at the end of the Hami oasis. The great Gobi, in its awful loneliness, stretched out before us like a vast ocean of endless space. The growing darkness threw its mantle on the scene, and left imagination to picture for us the nightmare of our boyhood days. We seemed, as it were, to be standing at the end of the world, looking out into the realm of nowhere. Foreboding thoughts disturbed our repose as we contemplated the 400 miles of this barren stretch to the Great Wall of China. With an early morning start, however, we struck out at once over the 85 miles of the Taklamakan sands. This was the worst we could have, for beyond the caravan station of Kushi we would strike the projecting limits of Mongolian Kansu. This narrow tract, now lying to our left between Hami and the Nanshan Mountains, is characterized by considerable diversity in its surface, soil, and climate. Traversed by several copious streams from the Nanshan Mountains, and the moisture-laden currents from the Bay of Bengal and the Brahmaputra Valley, its desert stretches are not the dismal solitudes of the Tarim Basin or the black and red sands of Central Asia. Water is found almost everywhere near the surface, and springs bubble up in the hollows, often encircled by exterior oases. Everywhere the ground is traversable by horses and carts. This comparatively fertile tract, cutting the Gobi into two great sections, has been, ever since its conquest 2,000 years ago, of vast importance to China, being the only feasible avenue of communication with the western provinces and the more important link in the only great highway across the empire. A regular line of caravan stations is maintained by the constant traffic both in winter and summer. But we were now on a bit of the genuine Gobi, that is, sandy desert, of the Mongolian or Shamo of the Chinese. Everywhere was the same interminable picture of vast undulating plains of shifting reddish sands, interspersed with quartz pebbles, agates, and carnelians, and relieved here and there by patches of wiry shrubs, used as fuel at the desert stations, or lines of hillocks succeeding each other like waves on the surface of the shoreless deep. The wind, even more than the natural barrenness of the soil, prevents the growth of any vegetation except low, pliant herbage. Withered plants are uprooted and scattered by the gale-like patches of foam on the stormy sea. These terrible winds, which of course were against us, with the frequently heavy cart tracks, would make it quite impossible to ride. The monotony of many weary hours of plodding was relieved only by the bones of some abandoned beast of burden, or the occasional train of Chinese carts, or rather two-wheeled vans, loaded with merchandise and drawn by 5 to 6 horses or mules. For miles away they would see us coming, and crane their necks in a wondering gaze as we approached. The mulish leaders with distended ears would view our strange-looking vehicles with suspicion, and then lurch far out in their 20-foot traces, pulling the heavily loaded vehicles from the deep-rutted track. but the drivers were too busy with their eyes to notice any little divergence of this kind. Dumb with astonishment, they continued to watch us till we disappeared again toward the opposite horizon. Farther on, we would meet a party of Chinese emigrants or exiles on their way to the fertile regions that skirt the northern and southern slopes of the Tian Shan Mountains. By these people, even the distant valley of the Li is being largely populated. Being on foot, with their extraordinary loads balanced on flexible shoulder poles, these poor fellows could make only one station, or from 12 to 20 miles a day. In the presence of their patience and endurance, we were ashamed to think of such a thing as hardship. The station houses on the desert were nothing more than a collection of mud huts near a surface well of strongly brackish water. Here most of the caravans would put up during the day and travel at night. There was no such thing as a restaurant. Each one by turn must do his own cooking in the inn kitchen, open to all. We, of course, were expected to carry our own provisions and do our own culinary work like any other respectable travellers. This we had frequently done before where restaurants were not to be found. Many a time we would enter an inn with our arms filled with provisions purchased at the neighbouring bazaars, take possession of the oven and cooking utensils, and proceed to get up an American meal, while all the time 100 eyes or more would be staring at us in blank amazement. But here on the desert we could buy nothing but very coarse flour. When asked if they had an egg or a piece of vegetable, they would say, "Ma yu," there is none, in a tone of rebuke, as much to say, "My conscience, man, what do you expect on the Gobi?" We would have to be content with our own tea made in the iron pot fitting in the top of the mud oven, and a kind of sweetened bread made up with our supply of sugar brought from Hami. This we nicknamed our Gobi cake, although it did taste rather strongly of brackish water and the garlic of previous contents of the one common cooking pot. We would usually take a large supply for road use on the following day, or, as sometimes proved, for the midnight meal of the half-starved inn dog. The interim between the evening meal and bedtime was always employed in writing notes by the feeble flickering light of a primitive taper lamp, which was the best we had throughout the Chinese journey. A description of travelling in China would by no means be complete without some mention of the vermin which infest not only inns and houses, but the persons of nearly all the lower classes. Lice and fleas seem to be the sine qua non of Chinese life, and in fact the itching with some seems to furnish the only occasion for exercise. We have seen even shopkeepers before their doors on a sunny afternoon, amusing themselves by picking these insidious creatures from their inner garments. They are one of the necessary evils, it seems, and no secret is made of it. The sleeping kangs of the Chinese inns, which are made of beaten earth and heated in winter like an oven, harbour these pests the year round, not to mention the filthy coverlets and greasy pillows that were sometimes offered us. Had we not had our own sleeping bags and used the camera, provision bag, and coats for pillows, our life would have been intolerable. As it was, there was but little rest for the weary. The longest station on the desert was 31 miles. This was the only time that we suffered at all with thirst. In addition to the high mean elevation of the Gobi, about 4,000 feet, we had cloudy weather for a considerable portion of the journey, and in the Kansu district even a heavy thunder shower. These occasional summer rains form, here and there, temporary meres and lakes, which are soon evaporated, leaving nothing behind except a saline efflorescence. Elsewhere the ground is furrowed by sudden torrents tearing down the slopes of the occasional hills or mountains. These dried up riverbeds furnished the only continuously hard surfaces we found on the Gobi, although even here we were sometimes brought up with a round turn in a chuck hole, with the sound flying above our heads. Our aneroid barometer registered approximately 6,500 feet when we reached at dusk the summit of the highest range of hills we encountered on the desert journey. But instead of the station hut we expected to find, we were confronted by an old Mongolian monastery. These institutions, we had found, were generally situated, as this one, at the top of some difficult mountain pass, or at the mouth of some cavernous gorge, where the pious intercessors might, to the best advantage, strive to appease the wrathful forces of nature. In this line of duty the Lama was no doubt engaged when we walked into his feebly lighted room, but, like all Orientals, he would let nothing interfere with the performance of his religious duties. With his gaze centered upon one spot, his fingers flew over the string of beads in his lap, and his tongue over the stereotyped prayers, with a rapidity that made our heads swim. We stood unnoticed till the end, when we were at once invited to a cup of tea and directed to our destination, 5 li beyond. Toward this we plodded through the growing darkness and rapidly cooling atmosphere, for in its extremes of temperature the Gobi is at once both Siberian and Indian, and that, too, within the short period of a few hours. Some of the mornings of what proved to be very hot days were cold enough to make our extremities fairly tingle. End of section 10. Section 11 of Across Asia on a Bicycle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Shipp. Across Asia on a Bicycle by Thomas Allen. Chapter 5. Over the Gobi Desert, Part 3. A constant diet of bread and tea, together with the hard physical exercise and mental anxiety, caused our strength at length to fail. The constant drinking of brackish water made one of us so ill that he could retain no food. A high fever set in on the evening of August 15, and as we pulled into the station of Bay Doon Sar, he was forced to go to bed at once. The other, with the aid of our small medicine supply, endeavoured to ward off the ominous symptoms. In his anxiety, however, to do all that was possible, he made a serious blunder. Instead of antipyrin, he administered the poison sulphate of zinc, which we carried to relieve our eyes when inflamed by the alkali dust. This was swallowed before the truth was discovered. It was an anxious moment for us both when we picked up the paper from the floor and read the inscription. We could do nothing but look at each other in silence. Happily, it was an overdose, and the vomiting which immediately followed relieved both the patient and the anxious doctor. What to do we did not know. The patient now suggested that his companion should go on without him, and, if possible, send back medical aid or proper food, but not to remain and get worse himself. He, on the other hand, refused to leave without the other. Then, too, the outlying town of Nansi Chu, the first where proper food and water could be obtained, was only 1 day's journey away. Another effort was decided upon. But when morning came, a violent hurricane from the southeast swept the sand in our faces and fairly blew the sick man over on his wheel. Famishing with thirst, tired beyond expression, and burning with fever as well as the withering heat, we reached at last the bank of the Su La Ho. Eagerly we plunged into its sluggish waters and waded through under the walls of Nansi Chu. Nansi Chu was almost completely destroyed during the late Dungan rebellion. Little is now to be seen except heaps of rubbish, ruined temples, and the scattered fragments of idols. The neglected gardens no longer check the advancing sands, which in some places were drifting over the ramparts. Through its abandoned gateway we almost staggered with weakness and directed our course to the miserable bazaar. The only meat we could find was pork, that shibboleth between Mohammedism and Confucianism. The Dungan restaurant keeper would not cook it, and only after much persuasion consented to have it prepared outside and brought back to be eaten beneath his roof. With better water and more substantial food, we began, from this time on, to recuperate. But before us still a strong headwind was sweeping over the many desert stretches that lay between the oases along the Su La Ho, and with the constant walking our sandals and socks were almost worn away. For this reason we were delayed one evening in reaching the town of Diu Min Shan. In the lonely stillness of its twilight, a horseman was approaching across the barren plain, bearing a huge Chinese lantern in his hand and singing aloud, as is a Chinaman's custom, to drive off the evil spirits of the night. He started back as we suddenly appeared, and then dismounted hurriedly to throw his lantern's glare upon us. "Are you the 2 Americans?" he asked in an agitated manner. His question was surprising, Out in this desert country, we were not aware that our identity was known or our visit expected. He then explained that he had been instructed by the magistrate of Diu Min Shan to go out and look for us and escort us into the town. He also mentioned in this connection the name of Ling Darin, a name that we had heard spoken of almost with veneration ever since leaving Urumtsi. Who this person was we were unable to find out, beyond that he was an influential mandarin in the city of Suzhou, now only a day's journey away. Near that same 40th parallel of latitude on which our Asiatic journey was begun and ended, we now struck at its extreme western limit the Great Wall of China. The Kiao Yu Quan, or Jade Gate, by which it is here intersected, was originally so called from the fact that it led into the Khotang country, whence the Chinese traders brought back the precious mineral. This, with the Shanghai Quan near the sea and the Yuanmin Quan on the Nankow Pass, are the principal gateways in this wall of 10,000 li, which until forced by Genghis Khan protected the empire from the Mongolian nomads for a period of 1400 years. In its present condition, the Great Wall belongs to various epochs. With the sudden and violent transitions of temperature in the severe Mongolian climate, it may be doubted whether any portion of Shi Huangti's original work still survives. Nearly all the eastern section, from Ordos to the Yellow Sea, was rebuilt in the 5th century, and the double rampart along the northwest frontier of the plains of Peking was twice restored in the 15th and 16th. North of Peking, where this prodigious structure has a mean height of about 26 feet and width of 20 feet, it is still in a state of perfect repair, whereas in many western districts along the Gobi frontier, as here before us, it is little more than an earthen rampart about 15 feet in height, while for considerable distances, as along the road from Suzhou to Kanchou, it has entirely disappeared for miles at a stretch. Both the gate and the wall at this point had been recently repaired. We could now see it rising and falling in picturesque undulations as far as the Tibetan ranges. There it stops altogether, after a westward course of over 1,500 miles. In view of what was before us, we could not but smile as we thought of that French abbé who undertook in an elaborate volume to prove that the Great Wall of China was nothing more than a myth. We were now past another long-anticipated landmark, and before us, far down in the plain, lay the city of Suzhou, which, as the terminal point of the Chinese telegraph line, would bring us again into electric touch with the civilized world. But between us and our goal lay the Edzina River, now swollen by a recent freshet. We began to wade cautiously through with luggage and wheels balanced on our shoulders. But just at that moment we perceived, approaching from the distance, what we took to be a mounted Chinese mandarin and his servant leading behind him 2 richly caparisoned and riderless horses. At sight of us they spurred ahead and reached the opposite bank just as we passed the middle of the stream. The leader now rose in his stirrups, waved his hat in the air and shouted in clear though broken English, "Well, gentlemen, you have arrived at last." To hear our mother tongue so unexpectedly spoken in this out-of-the-way part of the world was startling. This strange individual, though clad in the regular mandarin garb, was light-complexioned and had an auburn instead of a black queue dangling from his shaven head. He grasped us warmly by the hand as we came dripping out of the water, while all the time his benevolent countenance fairly beamed with joy. "I am glad to see you, gentlemen," he said. "I was afraid you would be taken sick on the road ever since I heard you had started across China. I just got the news 5 minutes ago that you were at Kiao Kuan, and immediately came out with these 2 horses to bring you across the river, which I feared would be too deep and swift for you. Mount your ponies and we will ride into the city together." It was some time before the idea flashed across our minds that this might indeed be the mysterious Ling Darin, about whom we had heard so much. "Yes," said he, "that is what I am called here, but my real name is Splingard." He then went on to tell us that he was a Belgian by birth, that he had travelled extensively through China as the companion of Baron Richthofen, and had thus become so thoroughly acquainted with the country and its people that on his return to the coast he had been offered by the Chinese government the position of custom mandarin at Soochow, a position just then established for the levying of duty on the Russian goods passing in through the northwest provinces. That he had adopted the Chinese dress and mode of living, and had even married many years ago a Chinese girl educated at the Catholic schools in Tientsin. We were so absorbed in this romantic history that we scarcely noticed the crowds that lined the streets leading to the Ling Darin's palace until the boom of a cannon recalled us to our situation. From the smile on the jolly face beside us, we knew at once whom we could hold responsible for this reception. The palace gates were now thrown open by a host of servants, and in our rags and tatters we rolled at once from the hardships of the inhospitable desert into the lap of luxury. A surplus is not always so easily disposed of as a deficit. At least we were inclined to think so in the case of our Soochow diet. The Ling Darin's table, which for the exceptional occasion was set in the foreign fashion with knives and forks, fairly teemed with abundance and variety. There was even butter made from the milk of the Tibetan yak, and condensed milk for our coffee, the first we had tasted since leaving Turkey more than a year before. The Ling Darin informed us that a can of this milk, which he once presented to Chinese friends, had been mistaken for face cosmetic, and was so used by the ladies of the family. The lack of butter has led many of the missionaries in China to substitute lard, while the Chinese fry their fat cakes in various oils. The Ling Darin's wife we found an excellent and even artistic cook, while his buxom twin daughters could read and write their own language, a rare accomplishment for a Chinese woman. Being unaccustomed to foreign manners, they would never eat at the same table with us, but would come in during the evening with their mother, to join the family circle and read aloud to us some of their father's official dispatches. This they would do with remarkable fluency and intelligence. As guests of our highly respected and even venerated host, we were visited by nearly all the magistrates of the city. The Ling Darin was never before compelled to answer so many questions. In self-defense, he was at last forced to get up a stereotyped speech to deliver on each social occasion. The people, too, besieged the palace gates and clamoured for an exhibition. Although our own clothes had been sent away to be boiled, we could not plead this as an excuse. The flowing Chinese garments, which had been provided from the private wardrobe of the Ling Darin, fluttered wildly in the breeze as we rode out through the city at the appointed hour. Our Chinese shoes also were constantly slipping off, and as we raised the foot to readjust them, a shout went up from the crowd for what they thought was some fancy touch in the way of riding. From the barrenness of the Gobi to the rank vegetation of the Edzina Valley, where the grass and grain were actually falling over from excessive weight, was a most relieving change. Water was everywhere. Even the roadway served in many places as a temporary irrigating canal. On the journey to Kanchu, we were sometimes compelled to ride on the narrow mud wall fences that separated the flooded fields of wheat, millet, and sorghum, the prevailing cereals north of the Hoang Ho River. Fields of rice and the opium poppy were sometimes met with, but of the silkworm and tea plant, which furnished the great staples of the Chinese export trade, we saw absolutely nothing on our route through the northern provinces. Apart from the yellow lands of the Hoang Ho, which need no manure, the arable regions of China seem to have maintained their fecundity for over 4,000 years, entirely through the thoughtful care of the peasantry in restoring to the soil, under another form, all that the crops have taken from it. The ploughing of the Chinese is very poor. They scarcely do more than scratch the surface of the ground with their bent stick ploughs, wooden tooth drills, and wickerwork harrows. And instead of straight lines, so dear to the eye of a Western farmer, the ridges and furrows are as crooked as serpents. The real secret of their success seems to lie in the care they take to replenish the soil. All the sewage of the towns is carried out every morning at daybreak by special coolies, to be preserved for manure, while the dried herbs, straw, roots, and other vegetable refuse are economized with the greatest care for fuel. The Chinese peasant offsets the rudeness of his implements with manual skill. He weeds the ground so carefully that there is scarcely a leaf above the ground that does not appertain to the crop. All kinds of pumps and hydraulic wheels are worked either by the hand, animals, or the wind. The system of tillage, therefore, resembles market gardening rather than the broad method of cultivation common in Europe and America. The land is too valuable to be devoted to pasture, and the forests nearly everywhere have been sacrificed to tillage to such an extent that the material for the enormously thick native coffins has now to be imported from abroad. Streams and irrigating ditches were so frequent that we were continually saturated with water or covered with mud. Our bare arms and legs were so tanned and coated that we were once asked by a group of squalid villagers if foreigners ever bathed like themselves. On dashing down into a village, we would produce consternation or fright, especially among the women and children, but after the first onset, giggling would generally follow, for our appearance, especially from the rear, seemed to strike them as extremely ridiculous. The wheel itself presented various aspects to their ignorant fancies. It was called the flying machine and foot-going carriage, while some even took it for the fire-wheel cart or locomotive about which they had heard only the vaguest rumours. Their ignorance of its source of motive power often prompted them to name it the self-moving cart, just as the natives of Shanghai are wont to call the electric light the self-coming moon. In one out-of-the-way village of northwestern China, we were evidently taken for some species of centaurs. The people came up to examine us while on the wheel to see whether or no rider and wheel were one. We became so harassed with importunities to ride that we were compelled at last to seek relief in subterfuge, for an absolute refusal we found was of no avail. We would promise to ride for a certain sum of money, thinking thus to throw the burden of refusal on themselves. But, nothing daunted, they would pass around the hat. On several occasions, when told that eggs could not be bought in the community, an offer of an exhibition would bring them out by the dozen. In the same way we received presents of tea, and by this means our cash expenses were considerably curtailed. The interest in the foreign horses was sometimes so great as to stop business and even amusements. A rather notable incident of this kind occurred on one of the Chinese holidays. The flag-decked streets as we rode through were filled with the neighbouring peasantry, attracted by some travelling theatrical troupe engaged for the occasion. In fact, a performance was just then in progress at the open-air theatre close at hand. Before we were aware of it, we had rolled into its crowded auditorium. The women were sitting on improvised benches, fanning and gossiping, while the men stood about in listless groups. But suddenly their attention was aroused by the counter-attraction, and a general rush followed, to the great detriment of the temporary pedlars' stands erected for the occasion. Although entirely deserted and no doubt consumed with curiosity, the actors could not lose what the Chinese call face. They still continued their hideous noises, pantomimes and dialogues to the empty seats. The last 50 miles into Liangchao, a city founded by a Catholic Chinaman over 200 years ago, we were compelled to make on foot, owing to an accident that caused us serious trouble all through the remainder of our Chinese journey. In a rapid descent by a narrow pathway, the pedal of one of the machines struck upon a protuberance concealed by a tuft of grass, snapping off the axle and scattering the ball bearings over the ground. For some miles we pushed along on the bare axle inverted in the pedal crank, but the wrenching the machine thus received soon began to tell. With a sudden jolt on a steep descent it collapsed entirely and precipitated the rider over the handlebars. The lower side of the frame had broken short off, where it was previously cracked, and had bent the top bar almost double in the fall. In this sad plight we were rejoiced to find in the city under the shade the Scotch missionary Mr. Lawton, who had founded here the most remote of the China inland missions. But even with his assistance and that of the best native mechanic, our repairs were ineffective. At several points along the route we were delayed on this account. At last the front and rear parts of the machine became entirely separated. There was no such thing as steel to be found in the country, no tools fit to work with, and no one who knew the first principles of soldering. After endeavouring to convince the native blacksmiths that a delicate bicycle would not stand pounding like a Chinese cartwheel, we took the matter into our own hands. An iron bar was placed in the hollow tubing to hold it in shape, and a band of telegraph wire passed around from front to rear along the upper and lower rods, and then twisted so as to bring the two parts as tightly together as possible. With a waddling frame and patched rear wheel describing eccentric revolutions, we must have presented a rather comical appearance over the remaining 1,000 miles to the coast. Across the Yellow Huang Ho, which is the largest river we encountered in Asia, a pontoon bridge leads into the city of Lan Chao Fu. Its strategical position at the point where the Huang Ho makes its great bend to the north and where the gateway of the west begins, as well as its picturesque location in one of the greatest fruit-bearing districts of China, makes it one of the most important cities of the empire. On the commanding heights across the river, we stopped to photograph the picturesque scene. As usual, the crowd swarmed in front of the camera to gaze into the mysterious lens. All the missionaries we had met cautioned us against taking photographs in China, lest we should do violence to the many popular superstitions. But the only trouble we ever experienced in this respect was in arousing popular curiosity. We soon learned that in order to get something besides Chinese heads in our pictures, it was necessary first to point the camera in the opposite direction and then wheel suddenly round to the scene we wished to take. As we crossed the river, the bridge of boats so creaked and swayed beneath the rushing rabble that we were glad to stand once more upon the terra firma of the city streets, which were here paved with granite and marble blocks. As we rode down the principal thoroughfare, amid the usual din and uproar, a well-dressed Chinaman rushed out from one of the stores and grabbed us by the arm. "Do you speak English?" he shouted, with an accent so like an American that we leapt from our wheels at once, and grasped his hand as that of a fellow countryman. This, in fact, he proved to be in everything but birth. He was one of that party of mandarins' sons which had been sent over to our country some years ago as an experiment by the Chinese government to receive a thorough American training. We cannot here give the history of that experiment, as Mr. Wu related it, how they were subsequently accused of cutting off their queues and becoming denationalized, how in consequence they were recalled to their native land and degraded rather than elevated, both by the people and the government, because they were foreign in their sentiments and habits, and how at last they gradually began to force recognition through the power of merit alone. He had now been sent out by the government to engineer the extension of the telegraph line from Suzhou to Urumqi, for it was feared by the government that the employment of a foreigner in this capacity would only increase the power for evil which the natives already attributed to this foreign innovation. The similarity in the phrases telegraph pole and dry heaven had inspired the common belief that the line of poles then stretching across the country was responsible for the long existing drought. In one night several miles of pole were sawn short off by the secret order of a banded conspiracy. After several decapitations, the poles were now being restored and labelled with the words, "Put up by order of the Emperor." In company with the English missionary, Mr. Redfern, while attempting to get out of the city on the way to his mountain home, we were caught in another jam. He counselled us to conceal the weapons we were carrying in our belts, for fear the sight of them would incite the mob to some act of violence. Our own experience, however, had taught us that a revolver in China was worth nothing if not shown. For persistence, this mob surpassed any we had ever seen. They followed us out of the city and over the 3-mile stretch to the mission premises, and there announced their intention of remaining indefinitely. Again, Mr. Redfern feared some outbreak and counselled us to return to the city and apply to the Viceroy himself for protection. This proved a good move. A special exhibition on the palace parade grounds gained for us the valuable favour of one who was only 4th in rank to the Emperor himself. A bodyguard of soldiers was furnished not only during our sojourn in the city, but for the journey to Singanfu, on which a good reception was everywhere ensured by an official dispatch sent in advance. In order to secure for us future respect, a small flag with the government stamp and of yellow colour was given us to fly by the side of our stars and stripes. On this was inscribed the title of "The Travelling Students," as well as answers to the more frequent of the common questions, our nationality, destination, and age. The best mechanic in the local cannon foundry was then ordered to make, at government expense, whatever repairs were possible on our disabled machines. This, however, as it proved, was not much. Most of his time was spent in taking measurements and patterns for another purpose. If his intentions have been carried out, Lan Chao Fu is today possessed of a foot-moving carriage of home production. Our sojourn in this city is especially associated with the three names of Wu, Chu, and Mu, names by no means uncommon in Chinese nomenclature. We heard of a boy named the abstract numeral 65 because his grandfather happened to reach that age on the very day of his birth. Mr. Mu was the local telegraph operator with whom we and our friends Wu and Chu of Shanghai associated. All operators in the Chinese telegraph system are required to read and write English. The school established for this purpose at Lan Chao we occasionally visited and assisted the Chinese schoolmaster to hear the recitations from Routledge's spelling book. He, in turn, was a frequent partaker of our foreign chows, which our English-speaking friends served with knives and forks borrowed from the missionaries. Lily and bamboo roots, shark's fins and swallows' nests and many other Chinese delicacies were now served in abundance and with the ever-accompanying bowl of rice. In the manner of eating and drinking, Chinese formality is extreme. A round table is the only one that can be used in an aristocratic household. The seat of honour is always the one next to the wall. Not a mouthful can be taken until the host raises his chopsticks in the air and gives the signal. Silence then prevails, for Confucius says, "When a man eats, he has no time for talk." When a cup of tea is served to anyone in a social party, he must offer it to everyone in the room, no matter how many there are, before proceeding to drink himself. The real basis of Chinese politeness seems to be this: they must be polite enough to offer, and you must be polite enough to refuse. Our ignorance of this great underlying principle during the early part of the Chinese journey led us into errors both many and grievous. In order to show a desire to be sociable, we accepted almost everything that was offered to us, to the great chagrin, we fear, of the courteous donors. End of section 11.
Section 12 of Across Asia on a Bicycle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Awai in July 2016. Across Asia on a Bicycle by Thomas Allen. Chapter 6. An Interview with the Prime Minister of China. Our departure from Lanzhou was not, we thought, regretted by the officials themselves, for we heard that apprehension was expressed lest the crowds continuing to collect around the telegraph office should indulge in a riot. However, we were loath to leave our general friends for the society of opium smokers, for we were now in that province of China which, next to Szechuan, is most addicted to this habit. From dusk till bedtime, the streets of the villages were almost deserted for the squalid opium dens. Even our soldier attendant, as soon as the wooden saddle was taken from his sore-backed government steed, would produce his portable lamp and proceed to melt on his needle the wax-like contents of a small black box. When of the proper consistency, the paste was rolled on a metal plate to point it for the aperture in the flute-shaped pipe. Half the night would be given to this process, and a considerable portion of the remaining half would be devoted to smoking small pinches of tobacco in the peculiar Chinese water pipe. According to an official note issued early in 1882 by Mr. Hart, Inspector General of Chinese Customs, considerably less than 1% of the population is addicted to opium smoking, while those who smoke it to excess are few. More to be feared is the use of opium as a poison, especially among Chinese women. The government raises large sums from the import duty on opium and tacitly connives at its cultivation in most of the provinces, where the traders and mandarins share between them the profits of this officially prohibited drug. This part of the great historic highway on which we were now travelling, between the two bends of the Huang Ho, was found more extensively patronized than heretofore. Besides the usual caravans of horses, donkeys, and two-wheeled vans, we occasionally met with a party of shaven-headed Tibetans traveling either as emissaries or as traders in the famous Tibetan sheepskins and furs and the strongly scented bags of the musk deer. A funeral cortege was also a very frequent sight. Chinese custom requires that the remains of the dead be brought back to their native place, no matter how far they may have wandered during life, and as the carriage of a single body would often be expensive, they are generally interred in temporary cemeteries or mortuary villages until a sufficient number can be got together to form a large convoy. Mandarins, however, in death as in life, travel alone and with retinue. One coffin we met which rested upon poles supported on the shoulders of 32 men. Above on the coffin was perched the usual white rooster, which is supposed to incorporate, during transportation, the spirit of the departed. In funeral ceremonies, especially of the father, custom also requires the children to give public expression of their grief. Besides many other filial observances, the eldest son is in duty bound to render the journey easy for the departed by scattering fictitious paper money as spirit toll at the various roadside temples. Singanfu, the capital of the Middle Kingdom under the Qin dynasty, and a city of the first importance more than 2,000 years ago, is still one of the largest places in the empire, being exceeded in population probably by Canton alone. Each of its 4 walls, facing the cardinal points, is over 6 miles long and is pierced in the center by a monumental gate with lofty pavilions. It was here, among the ruins of an old Nestorian church, built several centuries before, that was found the famous tablet now sought at a high price by the British Museum. The harassing mobs gathered from its teeming population, as well as the lateness of the season, prompted us to make our sojourn as short as possible. Only a day sufficed to reach Tongquan, which is the central stronghold of the Huangho Basin and one of the best defended points in China. Here, between precipitous cliffs, this giant stream rushes madly by, as if in protest against its sudden deflection. Our ferry this time was not the back of a Chinese coolie, nor a jolting ox cart, but a spacious flatboat made to accommodate 1 or 2 vehicles at a time. This was rowed at the stern like the gondolas of Venice. The mob of hundreds that had been dogging our footsteps and making life miserable during our brief stop for food watched our embarkation. We reached the opposite shore, a mile below the starting point, and began to ascend from the river basin to the highlands by an excavated fissure in the famous yellow earth. This gives its name not only to the river it discolors, but, from the extensive region comprised, even to the emperor himself, who takes the title of Yellow Lord, as equivalent to Master of the World. The thickness of this, the richest soil in China, which according to Baron Richthofen is nothing more than so much dust accumulated during the course of ages by the winds from the northern deserts, is in some places at least 2,000 feet. Much ingenuity has been displayed in overcoming the difficulties offered for free communication by the perpendicular walls of these yellow lands. Some of the most frequented roads have been excavated to depths of from 40 to 100 feet. Being seldom more than 8 or 10 feet wide, the wheeled traffic is conducted by means of sidings, like the stations in the Suez Canal. Being undrained or unswept by the winds, these walled-up tracks are either dust-beds or quagmires, according to the season. For us, the autumn rains had converted them into the latter. Although on one of the imperial highways, which once excited the admiration of Marco Polo, we were now treated to some of the worst stretches we have ever seen. The mountain ascents, especially those stair-like approaches to the heavenly gates before reaching the Pe-Chili plains, were steep, gradeless inclines, strewn with huge upturned blocks of stone, over which the heavy carts were fairly lifted by the sheer force of additional horseflesh. The bridges, too, whose Roman-like masonry attests the high degree of Chinese civilization during the Middle Ages, have long since been abandoned to the ravages of time, while over the whole country the late Dungan rebellion has left its countless ruins. The people of Shanxi province are noted for their special thrift, but this quality, we observed, was sometimes exhibited at the expense of the higher virtue of honesty. One of the most serious of the many cases of attempted extortion occurred at a remote country town, where we arrived late one evening, after learning to our dismay that one of our remarkably few mistakes in the road had brought us just 50 miles out of the way. Unusually wearied as we were by the cross-country cuts, we desired to retire early. In fact, on this account we were not so observant of Chinese formality as we might have been. We did not heed the hinted requests of the visiting officials for a moonlight exhibition, nor go to the inn door to bow them respectfully out. We were glad to take them at their word when they said, with the usual hypocritical smirk, "Now, don't come out any farther." This indiscretion on our part caused them, as well as ourselves, to suffer in the respect of the assembled rabble. With official connivance, the latter were now free, they thought, to take unusual liberties. So far, in our dealings with the Chinese, we had never objected to anything that was reasonable, even from the native point of view. We had long since learned the force of the Chinese proverb that, in order to avoid suspicion, you must not live behind closed doors, and in consequence had always recognized the common prerogative to ransack our private quarters and our luggage, so long as nothing was seriously disturbed. We never objected either to their wetting our paper windows with their tongues, so that they might noiselessly slit a hole in them with their exceptionally long finger-nails, although we did wake up some mornings to find the pains entirely gone. It was only at the request of the innkeeper that we sometimes undertook the job of cleaning out the inn-yard, but this, with the prevalent superstition about the withering touch of the foreigner, was very easily accomplished. Nor had we ever shown the slightest resentment at being called "foreign devils," for this, we learned, was, with the younger generation at least, the only title by which foreigners were known. But on this particular night, our forbearance being quite exhausted, we ejected the intruders bodily. Mid mutterings and threats we turned out the lights, and the crowd as well as ourselves retired. The next morning the usual exorbitant bill was presented by the innkeeper, and, as usual, 1/2 or 1/3 was offered and finally accepted, with the customary protestations about being underpaid. The innkeeper's grumblings incited the crowd which early assembled, and from their whispers and glances we could see that trouble of some kind was brewing. We now hastened to get the wheels onto the road. Just then the innkeeper, at the instigation of the crowd, rushed out and grabbed the handlebars, demanding at the same time a sum that was even in advance of his original price. Extortion was now self-evident, and, remonstrance being of no avail, we were obliged to protect ourselves with our fists. The crowd began to close in upon us, until, with our backs against the adjoining wall, we drew our weapons, at which the onward movement changed suddenly to a retreat. Then we assumed the aggressive, and regained the wheels which had been left in the middle of the road. The innkeeper and his friend now caught hold of the rear wheels. Only by seizing their queues could we drag them away at all, but even then, before we could mount, they would renew their grasp. It was only after another direct attack upon them that we were able to mount and dash away. A week's journeying after this unpleasant episode brought us among the peanuts, pigs, and pigtails of the famous Pe Chili plains. Vast fields of peanuts were now being ploughed, ready to be passed through a huge coarse sieve to separate the nuts from the sandy loam. Sweet potatoes, too, were plentiful. These, as well as rice balls, boiled with a peculiar dry date in a triangular corn-leaf wrapper, were purchased every morning at daybreak from the pots of the early street vendors, and then proceeded to the local bake-shops, where the rattling of the rolling-pins prophesied of stringy fat cakes cooked in boiling linseed oil, and heavy dough biscuits cleaving to the urn-like oven. It was well that we were now approaching the end of our journey, for our wheels and clothing were nearly in pieces. Our bare calves were pinched by the frost, for on some of the coldest mornings we would find 1/4 of an inch of ice. Our rest at night was broken for the want of sufficient covering. The straw-heated kangs would soon cool off and leave us half the night with only our thin sleeping bags to ward off rheumatism. But over the beaten paths made by countless wheelbarrows we were now fast nearing the end. It was on the evening of November 3rd that the giant walls of the great residence, as the people called their imperial capital, broke suddenly into view through a vista in the surrounding foliage. The goal of our 3,116-mile journey was now before us, and the work of the 71st riding day almost ended. With the dusk of evening we entered the western gate of the Manchu city and began to thread its crowded thoroughfares. By the time we reached Legation Street, or, as the natives egotistically call it, the Street of the Foreign Dependencies, night had veiled our haggard features and ragged garments. In a dimly lighted courtyard we came face to face with the English proprietor of the Hôtel de Peking. At our request for lodging he said, "Pardon me, but may I first ask who you are and where you come from?" Our unprepossessing appearance was no doubt a sufficient excuse for this precaution. But just then his features changed, and he greeted us effusively. Explanations were now superfluous. The North China Herald correspondent at Pao Ting Hu had already published our story to the coast. That evening the son of the United States Minister visited us, and offered a selection from his own wardrobe until a Chinese tailor could renew our clothing. With borrowed plumes we were able to accept invitations from foreign and Chinese officials. Polite cross-examinations were not infrequent, and we fear that entire faith in our alleged journey was not general until, by riding through the dust and mud of Legation Street, we proved that Chinese roads were not altogether impracticable for bicycle travelling. The autumn rains had so flooded the low-lying country between the capital and its seaport Tientsin that we were obliged to abandon the idea of continuing to the coast on the wheels, which by this time were in no condition to stand unusual strain. On the other hand, the houseboat journey of 36 hours down the Pei Ho River was a rather pleasant diversion. Our first evening on the river was made memorable by an unusual event. Suddenly the rattling of tin pans, the tooting of horns, and the shouting of men, women, and children aroused us to the realization that something extraordinary was occurring. Then we noticed that the full moon in a cloudless sky had already passed the halfway mark in a total eclipse. Our boatmen now joined in the general uproar, which reached its height when the moon was entirely obscured. In explanation we were told that the Great Dragon was endeavoring to swallow up the moon, and that the loudest possible noise must be made to frighten him away. Shouts hailed the reappearance of the moon. Although our boatmen had a spattering of pidgin or business English, we were unable to get a very clear idea of Chinese astronomy. In journeying across the empire we found sufficient analogy in the various provincial dialects to enable us to acquire a smattering of one from another as we proceeded, but we were now unable to see any similarity whatever between "you makey wokey look see" and "you go and see," or between "that belong number 1 pidgin" and "that is a first-class business." This jargon has become a distinct dialect on the Chinese coast. On our arrival in Tientsin, we called upon the United States Consul, Colonel Bowman, to whom we had brought several letters from friends in Peking. During a supper at his hospitable home, he suggested that the Viceroy might be pleased to receive us, and that, if we had no objection, he would send a communication to the Yamen, or official residence. Colonel Bowman's secretary, Mr. Tenney, who had been some time the instructor of the Viceroy's sons, and who was on rather intimate terms with the Viceroy himself, kindly offered to act as interpreter. A favourable answer was received the next morning, and the time for our visit fixed for the afternoon of the day following. But 2 hours before the appointed time a message was received from the Viceroy, stating that he was about to receive an unexpected official visit from the Fan Tai, or treasurer, of the Pe Chili province, over which Li Hung Chang himself is Viceroy, and asking for a postponement of our visit to the following morning at 11 o'clock. Even before we had finished reading this unexpected message, the the booming of cannon along the Pei Ho River announced the arrival of the Fantai's boats before the city. The postponement of our engagement at this late hour threatened to prove rather awkward, inasmuch as we had already purchased our steamship tickets for Shanghai to sail on the Fei Ching at 5 o'clock the next morning. But through the kindness of the steamship company it was arranged that we should take a tugboat at Tong Ku on the line of the Kai Ping Railroad and overtake the steamer outside the Taku Bar. This we could do by taking the train at Tientsin even as late as 7 hours after the departure of the steamer. Steam navigation in the Pei Ho River, over the 40 or 50 miles stretch from Tientsin to the Gulf, is rendered very slow by the sharp turns in the narrow stream, the adjoining banks being frequently struck and ploughed away by the bow or stern of the large ocean steamers. When we entered the consulate the next morning, we found 3 palanquins and a dozen coolies in waiting to convey our party to the Viceroy's residence. Under other circumstances we would have patronized our steeds of steel, but a visit to the biggest man in China had to be conducted in state. We were even in some doubt as to the propriety of appearing before His Excellency in bicycle costume, but we determined to plead our inability to carry luggage as an excuse for this breach of etiquette. The first peculiarity the Chinese notice in a foreigner is his dress. It is a requisite with them that the clothes must be loose and so draped as to conceal the contour of the body. The short sack coat and tight trousers of the foreigner are looked upon as certainly inelegant, if not actually indecent. It was not long before we were out of the foreign settlement and wending our way through the narrow, winding streets, or lanes, of the densely populated Chinese city. The palanquins we met were always occupied by some high dignitary or official, who went sweeping by with his usual vanguard of servants and his usual frown of excessive dignity. The fact that we, plain foreign devils, were using this mode of locomotion made us the objects of considerable curiosity from the loiterers and passers-by, and in fact, had this not been the case, we should have felt rather uncomfortable. The unsympathetic observation of mobs and the hideous Chinese noises had become features of our daily life. End of section 12. Section 13 of Across Asia on a Bicycle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in July 2016. Across Asia on a Bicycle by Thomas Allen. Chapter 6. An Interview with the Prime Minister of China. Part 2. The Yamen courtyard, as we entered, was filled with empty palanquins and coolie servants waiting for the different mandarins who had come on official visits. The Yamen itself consisted of low one-story structures built in the usual Chinese style of wood and adobe brick, in a quadrangular form around an inner courtyard. The common Chinese paper, which serves for window glass, had long since vanished from the ravages of time and the finger-punches of vandals. Even here, at the Yamen of the Prime Minister of China, dirt and dilapidation were evident on every hand. The ante-room into which we were ushered was in keeping with its exterior. The paper that covered the low walls and squatty ceiling, as well as the calico covering on the divans, was soiled and torn. The room itself was filled with mandarins from various parts of the country, waiting for an audience with His Excellency. Each wore the official robe and dishpan hat, with its particular button or insignia of rank. Each had a portly, well-fed appearance, with a pompous, dignified mien overspreading his features. The servant by whom we had sent in our Chinese visiting cards returned and asked us to follow him. Passing through several rooms, and then along a narrow, darkened hallway, we emerged into an inner courtyard. Here there were several servants standing like sentinels in waiting for orders. Others were hurrying hither and thither with different messages entrusted to their care. This was all there was to give to the place the air of busy headquarters. On one side of the courtyard the doors of the Foreign Reception Room opened. Through these we were ushered by the liveried servant, who bore a message from the Viceroy, asking us to wait a few moments until he should finish some important business. The Foreign Reception Room in which we were now sitting was the only one in any official residence in the Empire, and this single instance of compliance with foreign customs was significant as bearing upon the attitude toward Western ideas of the man who stands at the head of the Chinese government. Everything about us was foreign except the Chinese divan in one corner of the room. In the middle of the floor stood a circular sofa of the latest pattern, with chairs and settees to match, and at one end a foreign stove, in which a fire had been recently lighted for our coming. Against the wall were placed a full-length mirror, several brackets, and some fancy work. The most interesting of the ornaments in the room were portraits of Li Hung Chang himself, Krupp the gunmaker, Armstrong the shipbuilder, and the immortal Chinese Gordon, the only foreigner, it is said, who has ever won a spark of admiration from the Chinese people. While we were waiting for the Viceroy, his second son, the pupil of Mr. Tenney, came in and was introduced in the foreign fashion. His English was fluent and correct. He was a bright, intelligent lad of 19 years, then about to take his first trial examinations for the Chinese degree of scholarship, which, if attained, would make him eligible for official position. Although a son of the Viceroy, he will have to rise by his own merit. Our conversation with the Viceroy's son extended over 10 or 15 minutes. He asked many questions about the details of our journey. "How," said he, "could you get along without interpreter, guide, or servant, when every foreigner who goes even from here to Peking has to have them?" He questioned us as to whether or not the Chinese had ever called us names. We replied that we usually travelled in China under the nom de Chinois, Yang Gui Za, the foreign devils, alias Ye Ren, the wild men. A blush overspread his cheeks as he said, "I must apologize for my countrymen. I hope you will excuse them, for they know no better." The young man expressed deep interest in America and American institutions, and said if he could obtain his father's consent he would certainly make a visit to our country. This was the only son then at home with the Viceroy, his eldest son being minister to Japan. The youngest, the Viceroy's favorite, was, it was said, the brightest and most promising. His death occurred only a few months before our arrival in Tientsin. We were holding an animated conversation when the Viceroy himself was announced. We all stood to show our respect for the Prime Minister, whom General Grant included among the 3 greatest statesmen of his day. The Viceroy was preceded by 2 body servants. We stood before a man who appeared to be over 6 feet in height, although his head and shoulders were considerably bent with age. His flowing dress was made of rich-coloured silk, but very plain indeed. Any ornamentation would have been a profanation of the natural dignity and stateliness of Li Hung Chang. With slow pace he walked into the room, stopped a moment to look at us, then advanced with outstretched hand, while a faint smile played about his features and softened the piercing glance of his eyes. He shook our hands heartily in the foreign fashion, and without any show of ceremony led the way into an adjoining room, where a long council table extended over half the length. The Viceroy took the armchair at the head, and motioned us to take the 2 seats on his left, while Mr. Tenney and the Viceroy's son sat on his right. For almost a minute not a word was said on either side. The Viceroy had fixed his gaze intently upon us, and, like a good general perhaps, was taking a thorough survey of the field before he opened up the cannonade of questions that was to follow. We in turn were just as busily engaged in taking a mental sketch of his most prominent physical characteristics. His face was distinctly oval, tapering from a very broad forehead to a sharp-pointed chin, half obscured by his thin grey goatee. The crown of his head was shaven in the usual Qing fashion, leaving a tuft of hair for a queue, which in the Viceroy's case was short and very thin. His dry, sallow skin showed signs of wrinkling. A thick fold lay under each eye, and at each end of his upper lip. There were no prominent cheekbones or almond-shaped eyes, which are so distinctively seen in most of the Mongolian race. Under the scraggy moustache we could distinguish a rather benevolent though determined mouth, while his small, keen eyes, which were somewhat sunken, gave forth a flash that was perhaps but a flickering ember of the fire they once contained. The left eye, which was partly closed by a paralytic stroke several years ago, gave him a rather artful, waggish appearance. The whole physiognomy was that of a man of strong intuition, with the ability to force his point when necessary, and the shrewd common sense to yield when desiring to be politic. "Well, gentlemen," he said at last, through Mr. Tenney as interpreter, "you don't look any the worse for your long journey." "We are glad to hear your Excellency say so," we replied. "It is gratifying to know that our appearance speaks well for the treatment we have received in China." We hope our readers will consider the requirements of Chinese etiquette as sufficient excuse for our failure to say candidly that, if we looked healthy, it was not the fault of his countrymen. "Of all the countries through which you have passed, which do you consider the best?" the Viceroy then asked. In our answer to this question the reader would no doubt expect us to follow etiquette and say that we thought China was the best, and perhaps the Viceroy himself had a similar expectation. But between telling a positive lie and not telling the truth, there is perhaps sufficient difference to shield us from the charge of gross inconsistency. We answered, therefore, that in many respects we considered America the greatest country we had seen. We ought of course to have said that no reasonable person in the world would ever think of putting any other country above the Celestial Empire. Our bluntness elicited some surprise, for the Viceroy said, "If then you thought that America was the best, why did you come to see other countries?" "Because, until we had seen other countries," we replied, "we did not know that America was the best." But this answer the Viceroy evidently considered a mere subterfuge. He was by no means satisfied. "What was your real object in undertaking such a peculiar journey?" he asked rather impatiently. "To see and study the world and its peoples," we answered, "to get a practical training as a finish to a theoretical education. The bicycle was adopted only because we considered it the most convenient means of accomplishing that purpose." The Viceroy, however, could not understand how a man should wish to use his own strength when he could travel on the physical force of someone else, nor why it was that we should adopt a course through Central Asia and northwestern China, when the southern route through India would have been far easier and less dangerous. He evidently gave it up as a conundrum, and started out on another line. "Do you consider the Shah of Persia a powerful monarch?" was his next question. "Powerful, perhaps, in the Oriental sense," we replied, "but very weak in comparison with the Western nations. Then, too, he seems to be losing the power that he does have. He is compelled to play more and more into the hands of the Russians." "Do you think that Russia will eventually try to take possession of Persia?" the Viceroy interrupted. "That, of course, is problematical," we answered, with the embarrassment men of our age might feel at being instigated to talk politics with a prime minister. "What we do know for certain is that Russia is now, with her Trans-Caspian Railroad, within about 40 miles of Meshed, the capital of Persia's richest province of Khorasan, that she now has a well-engineered and, for a great portion of the way, a macadamized road to that city across the Kopet Dag Mountains from Askabad, the capital of Russian Transcaspia, and that half that road the Persians were rather forcibly invited to construct." "Do you think," again interrupted the Viceroy, whose interest in the Russians now began to take a more domestic turn, "that the Russians would like to have the Chinese province of Ili?" To this question we might very appropriately have said "No," for the reason that we thought Russia had it already. She is only waiting to draw it in when she feels certain that her Siberian flank is better protected. The completion of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, by which troops can be readily transported to that portion of her dominion, may change Russia's attitude toward the province of Ili. We did not, however, say this to His Excellency. We merely replied that we believed Russia was seldom known to hold aloof from anything of value, which she thought she could get with impunity. As she was now sending cartload after cartload of goods over the border, through Ili, into northern and western China, without paying a cent of customs duty, while on the other hand not even a leaf of tea or thread of cotton passed over the Russian line from China, without the payment of an exorbitant tariff, and as she had already established in Kuldja a postal, telegraph, and Cossack station, it would seem that she does not even now view the province of Ili as wholly foreign to the Russian Empire. At this the Viceroy cleared his throat and dropped his eyes in thoughtful mood, as much as to say, "Ah, I know the Russians, but there is no help for it." At this point we ventured to ask the Viceroy if it were true, as we had been informed, that Russia had arranged a treaty with China, by which she was entitled to establish consuls in several of the interior provinces of the Chinese Empire, but he evaded the question with adroitness and asked, "Didn't you find the roads very bad in China?" This question was creditable to the Viceroy's knowledge of his own country, but to this subject we brought the very best Chinese politeness we could muster. We said that inasmuch as China had not yet adopted the bicycle, her roads, of course, were not adapted to that mode of locomotion. The Viceroy then asked us to describe the bicycle, and inquired if such a vehicle did not create considerable consternation among the people. We told him that the bicycle, from a Chinese point of view, was capable of various descriptions. On the passports given us by the Chinese minister in London, the bicycle was called a seat-sitting, foot-moving machine. The natives in the interior had applied to it various epithets, among which were Yang Ma, foreign horse, Fei Chai, flying machine, Sutsun Chai, self-moving cart, and others. The most graphic description, perhaps, was given by a Chinaman whom we overheard relating to his neighbors the first appearance of the bicycle in his quiet little village. "It is a little mule," said he, "that you drive by the ears and kick in the sides to make him go." A dignified smile overspread the Viceroy's features. "Didn't the people try to steal your money?" he next inquired. "No," we replied. From our impoverished appearance, they evidently thought we had nothing. Our wardrobe being necessarily limited by our mode of travel, we were sometimes reduced to the appearance of travelling mendicants, and were often the objects of pity or contempt. Either this, or our peculiar mode of travel, seemed to dispel all thought of highway robbery. We never lost even so much as a button on our journey of over 3,000 miles across the Chinese Empire. "Did the governors you met treat you well?" he asked, and then immediately added, "Being scholars, were you not subjected to some indignity by being urged to perform for every mandarin you met?" "By nearly all the governors," we said, "we were treated very kindly indeed, but we were not so certain that the same favours would have been extended to us had we not cheerfully consented to give exhibitions of bicycle riding." There was now a lull in the conversation. The Viceroy shifted his position in his chair and took another whiff from the long, slender Chinese pipe held to his mouth by one of his body servants. One whiff, and the pipe was taken away to be emptied and refilled. After a short respite, he again resumed the conversation, but the questions he now asked were of a personal nature. We enumerate a few of them without comment, only for the purpose of throwing some additional light on the character of our questioner. "About how much did the trip cost you? Do you expect to get back all or more than you spent? Will you write a book? Did you find on your route any gold or silver deposits? Do you like the Chinese diet? And how much did one meal cost you? How old are you?" One of the first questions a Chinese host usually asks his guest. "Are you married? What is the trade or profession of your parents? Are they wealthy? Do they own much land? A Chinaman's idea of wealth is limited somewhat by the amount of land owned. Will you telegraph to your parents from Shanghai your safe arrival there? Were you not rash in attempting such a journey? Suppose you had been killed out in the interior of Asia, no one would have ever heard of you again. Are you Democrats or Republicans? The Viceroy showed considerable knowledge of our government and institutions. Will you run for any political office in America? Do you ever expect to get into Congress? Do you have to buy offices in America? Was the last inquiry. There was considerable hesitancy on the part of us both to answer this question. Finally, we were obliged to admit that sometimes such was the case. "Ah," said the Viceroy, "that is a very bad thing about American politics." But in this censure he was even more severe on his own country than America. Referring to ourselves in this connection, the Viceroy ventured to predict that we might become so well known as the result of our journey that we could get into office without paying for it. "You are both young," he added, "and can hope for anything." During the conversation the Viceroy frequently smiled, and sometimes came so near overstepping the bounds of Chinese propriety as to chuckle. At first his reception was more formal, but his interest soon led him to dispense with all formality, and before the close of the interview the questions were rapidly asked and discussed. We have had some experience with examining attorneys, and an extended acquaintance with the American reporter, but we are convinced that for genuine inquisitiveness Li Hung Chang stands peerless. We made several attempts to take leave, but were interrupted each time by a question from the Viceroy. Mr. Tenney, in fact, became fatigued with the task of interpreting, so that many of the long answers were translated by the Viceroy's son. The interview was conducted as nearly as possible in the foreign fashion. We smoked cigarettes, and a bottle of champagne was served. Finally the interview was brought to a close by a health from the Viceroy to Ta Ma Quo, the great American country. In conclusion we thanked the Viceroy for the honor he had done us. He replied that we must not thank him at all, that he was only doing his duty. "Scholars," said he, "must receive scholars." The Viceroy rose from his chair with difficulty. The servant took him by the elbows and half lifted him to his feet. He then walked slowly out of the room with us, and across the courtyard to the main exit. Here he shook us heartily by the hand and bowed us out in the Chinese manner. Li Hung Chang is virtually the Emperor of the Celestial Empire. The present Son of Heaven, the young Emperor, has only recently reached his majority. Li Hung Chang is China's intellectual height, from whom emanate nearly all her progressive ideas. He stands today in the light of a mediator between foreign progressiveness and native prejudice and conservatism. It has been said that Li Hung Chang is really anti-foreign at heart, that he employs the Occidentals only long enough for them to teach his own countrymen how to get along without them. Whether this be so or not, it is certain that the Viceroy recognizes the advantages to be derived from foreign methods and inventions, and employs them for the advancement of his country. Upon him rests the decision in nearly all the great questions of the empire. Scarcely an edict or document of any kind is issued that does not go over his signature or under his direct supervision. To busy himself with the smallest details is a distinctive characteristic of the man. Systematic methods, combined with an extraordinary mind, enable him to accomplish his Herculean task. In the eastern horizon, Li Hung Chang shines as the brilliant star of morning that tells us of the coming of a brighter dawn. End of section 13. End of Across Asia on a Bicycle by Thomas Allen.